Hey guys, welcome aboard to Snoozy Voyager, and tonight we're going somewhere ancient, dusty, and absolutely unhinged. We're going to ancient Egypt, not the Egypt of golden pharaohs and majestic sunsets over the Nile, not the Egypt from that one documentary your dad fell asleep to in 2003. No. Tonight we are talking about the women who existed in the shadows of all that grandeur, the prostitutes of ancient Egypt. Yes, you heard that correctly. Dim the lights, put on your fan, pull your blanket up to your chin, and prepare to learn things that your history teacher absolutely did not cover. Not even in a whisper, not even on a dare. But first, if you're enjoying Snoozy Voyager, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually want to. Genuinely. No pressure. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. It is always somehow 2 a.m. somewhere, and I love you people. Several of you have been asking for ancient Egypt content, and here we are. This one is for you. You absolute legends. Now dim those lights. Turn on that fan, tuck in your feet so whatever is under your bed cannot grab your toes. Get comfortable. Maybe crack your neck. You've earned it. It's been a day. And now, pause. Just for a second. Have you ever wondered what life actually looked like for a woman in ancient Egypt who lived outside the palace walls? Did she have rights? Did she have income? Did she have opinions about her clients? And if so, where exactly did she voice them? Was there a system? Were there rules? Was there, and I cannot stress this enough, was there paperwork? Could you negotiate your rate in hieroglyphics? Could you file a complaint with a scribe if someone stiffed you on payment? Did the pharaoh know this was happening directly under his very large, very golden nose? And most importantly, did any of these women eventually just decide they were done and go open a bakery instead? Congratulations. You have just woken up in ancient Egypt. The year is approximately 1200 BCE. The Nile is flooding right on schedule. Someone nearby is embalming something. The sun is already trying to kill you. And somewhere, in a city that has been standing longer than most modern countries have been ideas, a woman is doing her job, navigating a world that is far more complicated, far more bureaucratic, and far more human than anyone ever told you. Welcome. Let's begin. The Egypt you've just landed in is not a ruin. It is alive, loud, and absolutely packed. The cities hum with merchants, priests, soldiers, scribes, and farmers, who all have opinions, and all of them are sharing those opinions at full volume in the marketplace. The Nile is the spine of everything. It floods, it recedes, it deposits rich black soil, and then the whole cycle begins again, as reliable as your alarm clock and considerably more useful. You live in a civilization that has been running for over 2,000 years before this moment, which means it has had time to develop opinions on absolutely everything. Architecture, religion, cosmetics, bread, beer, and yes, the regulation of sexual commerce. Ancient Egypt was not a simple place. It was a bureaucratic empire obsessed with record-keeping, social order, and the correct way to do absolutely everything. And into this highly organized world, you're about to be introduced to women who existed in a space that was simultaneously acknowledged, regulated, occasionally sacred, and almost entirely unspoken about in polite company, which, in a civilization this meticulous, is saying quite a lot. The streets you walk through are made of mud brick, sun-dried and stacked with remarkable efficiency. The smell is immediate and comprehensive. Roasting bread, animal dung, river silt, rendered fat, incense drifting from the temple 3 streets over where someone has been burning kai-fi since before dawn. You step around a goat. The goat has opinions. everything in ancient Egypt has opinions. Above the rooftops, the sun is already doing what the Egyptian sun does best, which is to remind you, personally, that it could end you without breaking a sweat. Memphis is one of the great administrative cities of the ancient world. It is a place of enormous contrasts, grand temples built to impress the gods, and immediately adjacent narrow alleyways packed with bakeries, breweries, and workshops where people are making things with their hands from sunrise until the light fails them. The wealthy live in whitewashed houses with gardens and painted walls. Most people do not live in those houses. Most people live in smaller, darker, more crowded arrangements, and they navigate their days with the particular resourcefulness of people who do not have the option of failing to be resourceful. Your day, if you are an ordinary Egyptian woman in the New Kingdom, begins before the heat becomes oppressive. You grind grain, you bake bread. If you work outside the home, and many women did, in ways that would surprise people who assume ancient women were entirely domestic, you're already moving through the city, conducting the business of your life with brisk efficiency. Egyptian women bought and sold in the marketplace. They managed households that functioned as economic units. They brewed the beer that was consumed at every social level of society, from labourers eating lunch to priests conducting ritual. And somewhere in this city, in a tavern near the river, in a neighbourhood that the scribes mentioned only in disapproving terms, in a rented room above a warehouse, a woman is also conducting a different kind of business. She is not invisible. She is not hidden. The city knows she is there. The city has simply decided collectively that the knowing is different from the acknowledging. This is a very old human arrangement, and ancient Egypt was very, very good at it. You're living in the most organized civilization on earth. It has a god for almost every occasion, a scribe for almost every transaction, and a form of denial so sophisticated it has been running for millennia without anyone stopping to point out the obvious. Welcome to Egypt. Try not to get too much sun. You already look a little pink. Here is your first challenge. Almost everything we know about prostitution in ancient Egypt has to be pieced together from sources that were not exactly designed to discuss it directly. The Egyptians were enthusiastic record keepers. They documented grain shipments, tax assessments, legal disputes, and the precise measurements of pyramid chambers. What they did not do, with any particular enthusiasm, was write clear, organised treatises on the world's oldest profession. What we have instead are fragments, a legal document here, a piece of erotic art there, a cautionary poem written by a scribe who clearly had feelings about the subject. Historians have spent decades arguing about what these fragments actually mean, which is either thrilling or deeply exhausting depending on how much you enjoy academics fighting about ancient papyrus. The picture that emerges is incomplete, contested, and occasionally baffling. It is also somehow deeply human, because the gaps in the record tell their own story about what ancient Egyptian society was and was not comfortable writing down, and that silence is almost as interesting as the words themselves. Think about what it means to have a civilization this thorough, this obsessive about documentation, and still have enormous blank spaces in the record. The Egyptians counted their grain down to the last hekat. They recorded the weight of gold paid in wages to the workers who built the royal tombs. They noted, with bureaucratic precision, when a labourer was absent because of, and this is a real entry in a real document, a scorpion bite. They are not a people who left things unrecorded by accident. This silence around commercial sexuality was therefore a choice. A collective, sustained, extraordinarily well-maintained choice that ran for thousands of years with impressive consistency. Some of the evidence we do have was not intended to be evidence at all. The Turin erotic papyrus was not a historical survey. The wisdom texts warning young scribes away from women of low reputation were not sociological studies. A court document mentioning a woman by name in connection with a property dispute was not trying to tell us anything about the broader world she inhabited, it was just trying to resolve a property dispute. Historians working in this space are essentially doing the academic equivalent of reading someone's grocery list and a few overheard arguments and trying to reconstruct the entire household from those fragments. It is painstaking work, and the conclusions are almost always provisional. What makes it more complicated is the layer of interpretation that other ancient cultures applied. Greek and Roman writers had opinions about Egypt. They were fascinated by it, somewhat condescending about it, and occasionally wildly inaccurate in their descriptions of it. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE and wrote extensively about it, has a complicated reputation among Egyptologists. Some of what he recorded checks out. Some of it appears to be what a Greek man wanted to believe about a place that struck him as exotic and strange, which is a different thing entirely from what was actually happening. So you are standing in this ancient city, looking for evidence of lives that the city's record keepers decided not to officially preserve, filtered through the interpretations of people who may or may not have understood what they were looking at. The mystery is genuine, and the fact that the mystery exists, that this civilization went to such lengths to document everything except this, is itself the most interesting thing the papyrus has ever told us. Some silences are louder than words. Egypt on this subject has been deafening for 3,000 years. Before you can understand her life, you need to understand something genuinely surprising. Compared to almost every other ancient civilization running at the same time, Egyptian women had an extraordinary amount of legal standing. They could own property, they could inherit, they could bring lawsuits, they could divorce their husbands and in some cases walk away with a financial settlement. They could run businesses, sign contracts, and serve as witnesses in legal proceedings. This was not normal for the ancient world. A woman in ancient Greece, or Rome, at roughly the same period was, legally speaking, about as autonomous as a particularly well-regarded piece of furniture. In Egypt, the situation was meaningfully different. This matters for our story because it means that women who engaged in commercial sex in ancient Egypt were not automatically stripped of all legal protections simply by virtue of their profession. They could still, in theory, own what they earned, bring a complaint before a court, and exist as a recognized person within the legal framework. A nuance that is easy to miss if you assume antiquity was uniformly grim for women, which, to be fair, it mostly was. But Egypt was a notable and genuinely interesting exception. Let's be precise about what this means in practice, because the gap between legal theory and lived reality in the ancient world was, to put it mildly, vast. Yes, Egyptian women could own property. Yes, and they could bring legal cases, but the courts were staffed by men. The scribes who recorded transactions were men. The local officials who enforced decisions were men. Social status, connections, and the very practical question of whether anyone with authority was willing to take your complaint seriously all shaped how far the law's theoretical protections actually extended to you in a specific moment on a specific day. Having rights on papyrus and having rights in practice are two different things in every era of human history. Ancient Egypt was not exempt from this phenomenon. That said, the baseline matters. The baseline is genuinely different from what was happening in Athens. where women could not own property in their own names, could not enter into contracts independently, and were considered legal dependents of the nearest male relative for their entire lives. An Egyptian woman who acquired property had a legally recognized claim to it that her Athenian contemporary simply did not have. An Egyptian woman who was cheated in a business transaction could, in principle, take that grievance before a court and have it heard. That is not nothing. That is, in the context of the ancient world, quite a lot. For a woman navigating the commercial sex economy, this legal framework was a form of structural protection, imperfect, partial, and frequently ignored, but present. It meant that what she earned, she could keep. It meant that a piece of land, a house, a storage room full of goods that she had accumulated through her own efforts, was recognized as hers in a way that law would nominally defend. Yes, it meant that if someone attempted to take it from her through fraud or force, she had at least the theoretical option of a legal remedy. It also meant something else, something that is easy to miss entirely. It meant that she was a person, not a citizen in the full political sense, not an equal in the social sense, but a recognized legal subject with standing before the law. In the ancient world, that distinction mattered more than almost anything else, and Egypt, for all its hierarchies and all its silences, extended that recognition to women in ways that were genuinely unusual and that shaped the lives of even the women who existed furthest from the centre of its official concern. Now we arrive at the part of the story that historians have been arguing about for over a century, and the argument is still going. For a long time, scholars believed that ancient Egypt, like some of its neighbours, practiced what was called sacred or temple prostitution, the idea that certain women served in temples and engaged in sexual acts as a form of religious ritual, with proceeds going to the temple. It is a dramatic concept, and it became enormously popular in Victorian scholarship, partly because Victorian scholars were fascinated by anything ancient and sexual that they could write about in the language of anthropological concern. The problem is the evidence for widespread institutionalized temple prostitution in Egypt specifically is thin, genuinely, frustratingly thin. Some scholars believe it existed in limited forms, possibly tied to the cult of certain goddesses. Yet others believe the whole framework was projected onto Egypt by Greek and Roman writers who had their own cultural assumptions and were not always reliable narrators. What is clear is that the line between the sacred and the commercial was considerably blurrier in the ancient world than it is today, and that religious establishments were not as untouched by the economics of desire as anyone would have liked to officially record. The Victorian scholars who popularised the concept of sacred prostitution were working in a particular intellectual tradition that found the ancient world useful as a mirror for their own anxieties. If you could point to temple prostitution as a feature of ancient pagan civilizations, it served a very tidy narrative about the moral progress of Christian Europe, and that narrative was, shall we say, motivated. The scholarship that has developed since then, particularly since the 1980s and 90s, when historians began looking at the actual primary sources with much more critical attention, has significantly complicated the picture. Many scholars now believe that the concept of sacred prostitution, as it was classically described, was largely a construction, projected onto Eastern and Egyptian cultures by Greek writers who interpreted unfamiliar religious practices through their own cultural lens. What this means is not that nothing happened in or around Egyptian temples that had any connection to sexuality. That would be an overcorrection in the other direction. Temples were the economic centres of Egyptian cities. They employed enormous numbers of people, They held festivals that were, by all accounts, occasions of considerable abandon involving music, dancing, alcohol, and the general loosening of everyday constraints. The women who served as musicians and dancers in temple contexts, the kina, the musical troupes attached to temples and to the households of the elite, occupied an ambiguous social position that later Greek observers may have interpreted in ways that the Egyptian sources themselves do not support. So the honest answer is, probably not institutionalized sacred prostitution in the way the Victorians imagined it. Possibly some forms of ritual sexuality connected to specific cults in specific periods, the evidence for which is fragmentary and contested. Definitely a complicated relationship between temples, women, performance, and the economics of religious practice that does not map neatly onto modern categories, and certainly a willingness among ancient observers from other cultures to see what they expected to see rather than what was actually in front of them, which is, it turns out, a very human failing that has not been confined to the ancient world. To understand the cultural framework in which these women existed, you need to meet Hathor, goddess of love, beauty, music, fertility, and joy, and arguably one of the most important deities in the entire Egyptian pantheon. Hathor was not a niche goddess. She was everywhere. In temples, in jewellery, on mirrors, on the headrests people slept on, and in the music played at festivals that were, by all accounts, extremely lively. Her festivals were famous for their consumption of alcohol, their dancing, and their general atmosphere of sanctioned abandon. See, Hathor represented a theology that did not treat pleasure as inherently sinful, it treated it as a gift, something that existed within the divine order rather than against it. This is a meaningfully different starting point than the framework most of us were raised with. It does not mean ancient Egypt had no sexual mores or no concept of transgression. It absolutely did. But it does mean that the cultural ground was different, and that women who navigated the world of commercial intimacy were doing so within a theological landscape that was not automatically hostile to the body or to joy, even when it was complicated about everything else. Hathor was depicted in multiple forms, as a beautiful woman, as a cow, and most famously as a woman with cow's ears and a solar disk between curved horns. But her character remained consistent across all of them. She was warm, she was generous, she was the force that made the music play and the crops grow, and the beer ferment and the party worthwhile. She was also, in her aspect as the Eye of Ra, capable of extraordinary destructive fury, which says something useful about Egyptian theology's comfort with holding multiple contradictory truths about the same divine figure simultaneously. Hathor contained multitudes. The Egyptians respected that. Her festivals were, by ancient standards, remarkable occasions. The Festival of Drunkenness, celebrated in her honour, commemorated a mythological episode in which the gods used beer to prevent Hathor from destroying humanity in a rage, which is both a theology and an extremely effective argument for the social value of alcohol. During this festival, people were expected to drink heavily, to dance, to make music, and to approach the next day in a state of ritual renewal. The boundary between the religious and the sensual was, during these occasions, not just blurred but effectively dissolved, and the authorities, both human and divine, appear to have been fine with that. For the women of our story, the theological presence of Hathor provided something that is easy to undervalue, a framework in which their existence was not cosmically condemned. The Christian tradition that most of the Western world inherited framed sexuality outside of marriage as sin, and the women who traded in it as fallen. Egyptian theology offered no such clean condemnation. Hathor was still right there in her temple, receiving offering from people across the full social spectrum, including, Almost certainly, he had women who would not have been welcomed in more socially respectable religious contexts. The goddess did not turn anyone away. She was, in the truest sense of the word, extremely hospitable. This does not mean these women's lives were easy or respected or free from stigma. They were not, and we will get to that. But it does mean that the foundation was different, and that the particular cruelty of religious condemnation was not layered on top of everything else they already had to navigate. In the moral accounting of ancient Egypt, pleasure was not the enemy. That is a small thing, and also, depending on the life you are living, quite a large one. Let us step away from the temples and into the streets, because most of what we're talking about did not happen in sacred spaces. It happened in the places where people gathered, drank, and had money in their pockets. The taverns, the inns along the Nile trade routes, and the busy port areas of cities like Memphis and later Alexandria. Egypt sat at one of the great crossroads of the ancient world. Merchants came from Nubia, from the Levant, from the Aegean, from deep within Africa. Soldiers moved in enormous numbers. Labourers flooded into construction zones. All of these populations had one thing in common. They were away from home, they were sometimes paid, and they were looking for something to do in the evenings. The women who served this demand were, in many cases, attached to the tavern system, establishments run largely by women in ancient Egypt, a fact that tends to surprise people who picture ancient bars as exclusively male domains. The tavern keeper and the woman who offered additional services were sometimes the same person. Sometimes they were not. The economics were practical, the arrangements were varied, and the record we have of it all is scattered, partial, and filtered through the eyes of people who had strong opinions about it. The Nile was not just a river, it was a highway, an economic artery, and a daily spectacle of human movement on a scale that modern travellers would find difficult to picture. Boats of every size and description moved up and down it constantly. Grain barges, fishing vessels, military transports, and the elegant private crafts of the wealthy. Every landing point along the river was a node in a commercial network, and those nodes generated the particular kind of social infrastructure that follows trade everywhere it goes. Inns for travellers, stalls for merchants, taverns for everyone who had finished working and hadn't yet decided what to do next. Memphis, as the administrative capital for much of Egypt's history, was at the centre of this network. It was a city of perhaps 100,000 people at its height, enormous by ancient standards, with a port district that would have felt to modernise something like a very old, very sandy, very sunlit version of a busy harbour neighbourhood anywhere in the world. Loud, multilingual, smelling of fish and beer and the particular combination of commerce and humanity that has characterised port cities since the first boat landed somewhere profitable. But the women who worked in this environment were not sequestered or hidden. They were visible features of a landscape that everyone who passed through Memphis would have recognised and navigated around. A traveller arriving by boat, looking for a meal and a place to sleep, would have known what certain neighbourhoods offered beyond food and lodging. This knowledge was not secret. It was the kind of knowledge that gets passed between travellers, encoded in the practical geography of a city that has been receiving visitors long enough to have organised itself around their needs. What is striking, if you think about it from the women's perspective, is how embedded they were in the ordinary commercial fabric of the city. They were not operating in a separate, sealed-off underworld. They were in the taverns, the inns, the neighbourhoods along the river, the same spaces where grain merchants negotiated prices and scribes ate their lunch. The commerce of desire occupied the same streets as every other commerce. separated only by the social codes that everyone maintained with the determined, exhausting consistency of people who've decided that acknowledging something and talking about it are two completely different things. Here is something the history books rarely lead with. In ancient Egypt, the brewing and selling of beer, which was the primary social lubricant of the civilization, consumed by virtually everyone, including children in diluted form, was considered women's work. Women ran breweries, women ran taverns, women managed the distribution of one of the ancient Egypt's most essential products. This is not a footnote. This is a structural feature of the economy. The implication for our story is significant, because it means that the spaces where commercial sex likely occurred were spaces that were already economically organized, and in many cases managed by women. A woman running a tavern along the Nile was not operating in someone else's domain, she was operating in hers. The men who came in to drink were, in a commercial sense, guests in a space she controlled. What arrangements existed within that space? What additional services were offered or negotiated? Who set the terms? These are questions the papyrus does not fully answer. But the baseline is more interesting than you might have expected. It was not automatically a world of pure male control, even if it was still a world with significant dangers and very little formal protection. Egyptian beer was not the pale, carbonated thing you might picture. It was thick, nutritious, slightly alcoholic, and made from fermented bread, a product that required both skill and physical labour to produce consistently. It was also absolutely everywhere. Workers at the Giza Plateau were paid partly in beer rations. The labourers who built the royal tombs at Deir el-Medina received regular allocations of it. Priests drank it. Children drank it in weakened form because the water was frequently unsafe, and the beer, having been boiled in its production, was considerably less likely to kill you. Beer was, in ancient Egypt, less a luxury and more a public health measure. And the women who made it were not considered trivial figures. They were producing something essential. The tavern keeper, the woman who brewed the beer or ran the establishment, managed the accounts and served the clientele, occupied a social position that was simultaneously economically significant and socially ambiguous. She had income, she had skills. She had in many cases property in the form of the equipment and stock of her business. She also had a reputation for running a place where the moral atmosphere was, shall we say, relaxed, which meant the respectable parts of Egyptian society regarded her with the particular mixture of dependence and disapproval that they reserve for people whose services they could not do without. The wisdom texts are very helpful here, in their way. When they warned young men away from the woman of the tavern, they were warning against a specific, recognizable figure, not an abstraction, but someone who existed at a known address, in serving known products, in a space that the scribes writing those warnings had presumably visited themselves. The warning is very specific about the dangers. She will take your money, she will distract you from your work, she will compromise your reputation with your superiors. This is not a warning about an abstract moral failing. This is a warning about a particular commercial transaction in a particular kind of establishment, which tells you that the establishment was well understood, frequently patronized, and considered genuinely worth warning people about. What it also tells you is that the woman running that establishment had enough economic power to be seen as a genuine threat to a young man's financial stability, which is, in its way, a form of acknowledgement of her effectiveness as a businesswoman. So the scribes may not have meant it as a compliment, but 3,000 years later it reads like one. Ancient Egypt ran on a barter economy for most of its history. Coins did not arrive until the late period, introduced by outside influences. Before that, transactions were conducted in grain, linen, oil, copper Deben weights, and various other goods that served as standardized units of value. Which means that when we talk about what a woman might have earned in ancient Egypt's sex trade, we're talking about commodities, sacks of emmer wheat, bolts of linen, quantities of cooking oil, copper rings of known weight. We have some fragmentary evidence suggesting that rates for various services were roughly comparable to the daily wages of a labourer, not extravagant but not nothing either. For a woman at the bottom of the social hierarchy with few other economic options, it was income, and income was survival. For a woman with more options and more negotiating power, perhaps one who was already running a tavern, or one who had a client base of wealthier patrons, the arithmetic could look rather different. The economic reality of the trade was, as it always is, enormously variable depending on where you sat within it, and ancient Egypt was no exception. To understand what those earnings meant in practice, you need a sense of what things cost. A female labourer performing agricultural work in the New Kingdom might earn the equivalent of a few loaves of bread and a small measure of oil per day, enough to survive with very little left over for anything else. A skilled worker, a carpenter or a potter, I might earn several times that. A scribe or an administrator might earn considerably more. The earnings available through commercial sex, based on what fragments of evidence we have, sat somewhere in this range, possibly above unskilled labour wages for a woman with an established clientele, possibly at or below them for a woman working in the most precarious circumstances. The range was wide, and the experience of women at different points within that range was correspondingly varied. What she did with those earnings was shaped by the same constraints that shaped all economic life in ancient Egypt. Grain had to be stored before it went bad. Linen could be traded for other goods. Copper Deben could be used in market transactions with a fairly standardized exchange rate. A woman who was careful, who accumulated rather than spending immediately, who had somewhere safe to store what she earned, could potentially build a meaningful economic cushion over time. We have some evidence, in the form of property records and legal documents, that some women of lower social status did manage to accumulate small but real property holdings, a storage room, a share in a house, a piece of agricultural land through their own economic activity. Whether any of those women were in the trade we're discussing is not always clear from the documents themselves. What is clear is that the Egyptian economy was not designed to make accumulation easy for people at the bottom. The grain in your storage room could spoil. The linen could be stolen. A bad harvest meant that the value of everything you had saved could collapse overnight. And a woman without a husband or a family network to share these risks faced them alone, with no institutional safety net of any kind. The earnings were real. The economic precarity was also real. The combination of the two is what shaped the actual texture of these women's lives, a constant, exhausting negotiation between what was coming in and what could go wrong, conducted in sacks of wheat and bolts of cloth, while the Nile flooded on its ancient schedule outside, indifferent to all of it. Ancient Egypt produced a category of literature called wisdom texts, essentially collections of practical and moral advice written by learned men for younger men navigating the world. Think of them as ancient self-help books, except they were written on papyrus and occasionally stored in the walls of tombs. These texts, predictably, had opinions about women who sold sexual companionship, and those opinions were not charitable. The warnings were consistent. Stay away from women of low reputation. Do not spend your wages in taverns chasing pleasure. Do not let a woman of ill repute ruin your career prospects. This is both predictable and historically useful, because the very insistence of the warnings tells you something. You do not write extensive cautionary advice about something that does not exist and is not genuinely tempting. The scribes were not writing about an abstract hypothetical. They were writing about women their students would actually encounter in the cities, in the taverns along the river. The warnings were a moral framework imposed from above, but the world they were warning against was entirely real. And the women in it had been there long before the scribes picked up their reed pens. The Maxims of Ptah-hotep, one of the oldest wisdom texts we have, dating to the Old Kingdom, making it somewhere in the neighbourhood of 4,000 years old, spends considerable effort advising the reader on the proper management of desire. Stay away from women who are not yours. A moment of foolishness can undo a lifetime of careful reputation building. Women of low character will drain your resources and compromise your standing with your superiors. The tone is not outraged or particularly emotional, it is practical, in the way that advice about not leaving your grain storage unlocked is practical. This is a hazard. Here is how you avoid it. The instruction of any, written later in the New Kingdom, is even more specific. It warns against the woman of the pleasure house with explicit reference to her economic tactics. She is skilled at taking money, the text suggests, and a young man who does not know how to say no will find himself poorer and professionally compromised before he has realized what happened. Again, this is not a condemnation rooted in theological horror. It is a risk assessment delivered in the tone of a senior colleague telling a junior employee about the kinds of mistakes that end careers. What is conspicuously absent from these texts is any significant moral condemnation of the men who patronize the women in question. The warning is directed entirely at the client. Don't go there. Don't spend your money there. Don't let yourself be seen there. The woman herself is treated as a feature of the landscape, like a bad neighbourhood or an unreliable business partner. She's a risk to be managed. She's not in these texts a person whose interior life or circumstances are of any particular interest to the author. This one-sided framing is itself a historical document. It tells you whose perspective was considered worth recording, whose moral culpability was taken seriously, and whose existence was considered interesting only insofar as it posed a problem for the people the author actually cared about. The scribes were not trying to understand these women. They were trying to protect their students from them, and somewhere in that gap between the warning and the warned against, between the text and the life it was failing to describe, is where the real history lives, waiting for someone to ask the other questions. One of the frustrations of ancient history is that it mostly remembers men, and when it remembers women, it tends to remember queens, priestesses, and the wives of important people. The women we're talking about tonight rarely made it into the official record under their own names, but occasionally, in court documents, in administrative papyri, in the records of legal disputes, individual women surface. A woman named in a contract, a woman who brought a complaint before a local court, a woman whose name appears in a property record. These flashes of individuality are precious precisely because they are rare. They remind you that the category prostitute, or woman of the tavern, was not a monolith. It was a collection of individual people, each with her own circumstances, her own relationships, her own strategies for survival, and occasionally for advancement. Some of these women died in obscurity. Some appear to have acquired property. Some disappear from the record entirely, which could mean anything. Each name in the papyrus is a small window into a life that the official history of ancient Egypt was not particularly interested in preserving. The ostrata, pottery shards and limestone flakes used as informal writing surfaces throughout ancient Egypt. are some of the most valuable sources we have for the lives of ordinary people. The great papyrus documents recorded the transactions of the state, the decisions of courts, the accounts of temples. The Ostrasa recorded what people actually said to each other on a Tuesday. Notes passed between neighbours, complaints about unpaid debts, lists of goods owed and received. Brief, as impatient records of the small transactions that made up daily life. And in these informal records, women appear, named, specific, engaged in the business of their lives, in ways that the official record largely excludes. Deir el-Medina, the village of the workers who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, is one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in the world for this reason. Because the workers were literate, scribes and craftsmen who knew how to write. The site has produced thousands of ostraca recording the details of their daily lives with an intimacy that almost no other ancient Egyptian community can match. Among these records are women who conducted business, disputed debts, and occasionally appeared in legal proceedings in ways that suggest social positions outside the approved domestic roles. Whether any of them were sex workers in any formal sense is difficult to say, but they were women with names, women with agency, women who generated enough paperwork to have left a trace in the record to survive 3,000 years. That is something. The desire to find individual names, individual faces in a historical record that was designed to erase them is not just a scholarly impulse. It is a moral one. It is the insistence that the people who did not make it into the official history were nonetheless real, were nonetheless fully human, and deserved to be considered as individuals rather than as a category. When a woman's name appears in an ancient document, any document, for any reason, it is an act of involuntary self-preservation. She was here. The papyrus says so. And the fact that we can read her name today, in 3,000 years after she lived it, is the closest thing to resurrection that history offers. It is not enough, but it is not nothing either. Ancient Egypt was a civilization that paid close attention to appearance, but not in the way you might expect. Beauty here was not only about attraction, it was protection, identity, ritual, and sometimes even survival. The way a person presented themselves to the world carried meaning, whether they intended it or not. And for a woman working within the quieter, less documented corners of society, appearance was not optional. It was part of the work. You begin to notice this almost immediately. Faces around you are not bare. Eyes are lined in dark kohl, carefully applied in long, smooth strokes that extend slightly beyond the corners. At first, you might think this is purely aesthetic, but it serves a practical purpose as well. The kohl helps reduce the glare of the harsh Egyptian sun, and it offers a small layer of protection against infection. In a land where dust and heat are constant companions, even beauty has a function. Skin is often scented with oils, not heavy perfumes, but light, fragrant oils pressed from plants and flowers. They soften the skin, protect it from dryness, and leave behind a faint lingering scent. In crowded taverns or along busy trade routes, that scent becomes part of a person's presence. Something remembered. Hair, too, is rarely left untouched. Some women wear their natural hair, carefully styled and maintained. Others wear wigs made from human hair or plant fibres, shaped into thick, dark frames that sit neatly around the face. These wigs are not disguises. They are expressions. They signal care, effort, and sometimes status. And then there are the details that are quieter, less obvious. Jewellery made of simple beads or polished stones, bracelets that catch the light when a hand moves, small amulets worn close to the body tucked just beneath clothing. These are not always decorative. Many are protective, symbols of gods or spirits believed to guard the wearer from harm. You begin to understand that nothing here is accidental. For women navigating the world of commercial intimacy, appearance becomes something more deliberate, more intentional. It is not only about being seen, it is about being remembered, chosen, approached. There is some evidence scattered and debated of tattoos, patterns inked onto the skin, often along the thighs or lower abdomen. Some of these markings are associated with fertility, or with the goddess Hathor, whose domain includes love, music, and joy. Whether these tattoos were exclusive to certain women or more widely worn is something historians still quietly argue about. But the possibility alone tells you something important. The body itself could carry meaning, could tell a story, could signal identity in ways that words did not. Cosmetics, oils, fabrics, jewellery, each element layered carefully, not with extravagance, but with purpose. And yet there is a balance. Too much adornment might draw the wrong kind of attention. Too little might mean being overlooked entirely. The choices are constant, subtle, and shaped by experience, by observation, by quiet understanding of how people respond. In a world without written advertisements, without signs or formal declarations, the body becomes the introduction, a language of its own. And as you move through this environment, watching the way people present themselves, you begin to see it more clearly. The small adjustments, the deliberate touches, the quiet negotiations between visibility and safety. Nothing here is careless. Everything is part of the story she tells before a single word is spoken. Egypt is not only a land of temples and riverbanks, it is also a land of movement, of expansion, of armies travelling far beyond the familiar edges of the Nile. And where armies go, other lives begin to move alongside them. You might not notice it at first. The official records rarely speak of it directly. They list supplies, soldiers, routes, victories. They record numbers with careful precision. Yeah, but there are always gaps in those records. Quiet spaces where certain details are left unspoken, and within those spaces entire worlds exist. An army on the move is not just a collection of soldiers, it is a temporary society, a shifting environment made up of needs, food, shelter, tools, repair, and something else. Something less formally acknowledged, but no less real. Human companionship. As soldiers travel, especially over long distances, they are far from home, far from family, far from anything familiar. They carry with them not only weapons and rations, but also loneliness, restlessness, the need for distraction from the long stretches of waiting between moments of action. And slowly, almost quietly, others begin to follow. Women, often from difficult circumstances, sometimes from regions with limited opportunity, begin to move toward these camps, not in organised groups, not in any officially sanctioned way, but individually or in small clusters, drawn by the simple reality that where there are soldiers, there is the possibility of income. The environment is unstable. Military camps are not permanent. They shift with the movement of the army. 1 week near a riverbank, the next in a dry, unfamiliar landscape. There is no guarantee of safety, no formal protection, and very little structure beyond the needs of the soldiers themselves. And yet people adapt. Small informal economies begin to form. Food is traded, services are exchanged. Temporary shelters appear at the edges of camps. Fires burn at night, not only for warmth, but for gathering, for conversation, for the brief illusion of normal life in an otherwise uncertain place. For women in this environment, the work is different from that in the cities. There are fewer boundaries, less predictability. Clients change constantly. Language barriers may exist, especially in regions where Egyptian forces interact with foreign populations. Negotiation becomes more complex, more immediate, often relying on gesture, tone, and instinct rather than shared understanding. There is risk here, constant quiet risk. But there is also opportunity, in the most basic sense of the word. The possibility of earning something where other options are limited or non-existent. You begin to see how this becomes a pattern, not organized, not documented in neat lines of text, but repeated across time and place. Armies move, people follow, temporary worlds form and dissolve, and within those worlds, lives are lived, and are stories that are rarely written down. The official records will not tell you about the conversations that happen near those fires, or the small exchanges that take place at the edge of the camp, or the individuals who navigate the shifting environment day by day, making decisions in real time with very little margin for error. But you can imagine it. The sound of distant voices, the flicker of firelight against the dark, the sense of something temporary, fragile, and always on the verge of moving again, and within that movement she finds a way to exist. Not securely, not comfortably, but persistently, adapting, adjusting, continuing forward as the world around her refuses to stay still. Given that Egyptian women had genuine legal standing, it may come as a quiet surprise that even those living on the edges of society were not entirely without recourse. The system was not perfect. It was not always fair, but it existed, and sometimes that was enough. You begin to notice how structured this world really is. Beneath the noise of markets, the movement of traders, and the constant rhythm of daily life, there is an underlying order, a belief that disputes, no matter how small or how personal, can be brought forward, spoken aloud, and judged. This belief is rooted in the idea of ma'at, the concept of balance, truth, and proper order that holds the universe together. And in theory, everyone exists within it. Local courts, known as the Kenbet, meet regularly. They are not grand buildings with towering columns, but gatherings of officials and respected members of the community. They sit, they listen, they weigh what is said. There are no dramatic speeches, no elaborate performances, just voices, one after another, telling their version of events. And sometimes one of those voices belongs to a woman whose life does not fit neatly into the roles society prefers to acknowledge. You imagine her standing there, not dressed for ceremony, not shielded by status or family name, simply present, speaking for herself. Her complaint could be simple: payment not received, goods taken and not returned, a promise made and then quietly broken. The kinds of disputes that, in any time or place, shape the edges of daily survival. The court listens. That, in itself, matters, because in many other societies of the ancient world she would not even be allowed to speak. Her voice would be filtered through a man, or dismissed entirely, but here, at least in structure, she is recognized as an individual, someone who can own, who can lose, who can be wronged, and who can say so. Of course, reality is never as clean as theory. Status still matters. Reputation matters. The weight of a person's word can shift depending on who they are, who they know, and how they are perceived. A well-connected man will often be believed more easily than a woman standing alone. A scribe recording the case may shape the narrative in subtle ways, choosing which details to include and which to leave behind. And yet, the possibility remains. You begin to understand that this possibility is not a guarantee of justice. It is something quieter, something more fragile. It is the chance to try. Some records survive, fragments of disputes preserved on papyrus, unaware names appear briefly before disappearing again into history. A woman bringing a claim, a disagreement over property, a matter of payment contested. These documents are not dramatic, they do not tell full stories, but they hint at something important, that she was not entirely invisible, that she could step forward, that she could speak. You imagine the moment after the case is heard, the decision given, whatever it may be, perhaps in her favour, perhaps not. There is no certainty here, only outcome. And then life continues. She returns to the same world she came from, the same streets, the same work, the same quiet calculations of risk and survival. The court does not change her position in society. It does not remove the challenges she faces, but it leaves behind something small, a record, a trace, a moment where her voice entered the system and was acknowledged, however briefly. In a world where so much of her life passes unrecorded, this matters more than it might seem, because it means she was there, not just as a shadow in someone else's story, but as a person who spoke, who argued, who insisted, if only for a moment, that her experience counted. And in the quiet logic of Ma'at, that insistence becomes part of the balance, even if history only remembers it in fragments. Egypt's position as a trading empire meant that its cities were never still. They were not isolated places, but crossroads, points of arrival and departure, spaces where languages overlapped, where customs blended, and where people from distant lands found themselves sharing the same streets, even if only for a short while. You begin to notice this in small ways, as voices that sound slightly different, clothing cut in unfamiliar shapes, jewellery that reflects styles not native to the Nile, faces that carry the marks of long journeys, sun, wind, and distance. In the great cities, especially in places like Memphis, Thebes, and later Alexandria, this diversity becomes part of the background, something constant, expected. But within this movement, there are individuals whose paths into Egypt were not entirely chosen. Some arrive as traders, accompanying caravans or ships, staying longer than intended. Some arrive as labourers, following opportunities that may or may not last. And others arrive under far more difficult circumstances, captured in conflict, sold through networks of exchange, or displaced by forces beyond their control. And within these overlapping lives, you begin to see how the world of commercial intimacy becomes more complex. For foreign women, the experience is often shaped by distance, not just physical, but cultural. Language may not come easily. Customs are unfamiliar. Social expectations shift in subtle ways that take time to understand, and yet, life requires adaptation. In port areas especially, where ships arrive carrying goods and people from across the Mediterranean and beyond, there is a constant flow of movement. Sailors from different regions, merchants speaking different tongues, soldiers stationed far from their homes. These are spaces where difference is expected, even if not fully understood. For some women, this creates a narrow kind of opportunity. A shared language, even a partial one, can become valuable. The ability to communicate, to bridge small gaps between cultures, can shape how interactions unfold. A familiar accent might draw certain clients. A recognizable custom might create a sense of comfort in an otherwise foreign environment. But this advantage is fragile. Without strong ties to the local community, protection is limited. There are fewer familiar faces, fewer people who might intervene if something goes wrong. The informal networks that support others, Friends, family, long-standing relationships may not exist here, so new networks form, quiet alliances between those in similar positions, shared knowledge passed in low voices, warnings, advice, small pieces of information exchanged when the opportunity arises. You begin to understand that these connections are not formal, they are not recorded, but they are essential, because survival, in a place far from home, depends not only on individual decisions, but on what could be learned from others who have already navigated the same uncertainties. There is also another layer to this world. The presence of foreign communities within Egyptian cities creates spaces that feel slightly separate. Districts where certain languages are spoken more frequently, where familiar foods are prepared, where customs from distant places are maintained, even in small ways. Within these spaces, identity becomes something that shifts. A woman may be seen as foreign in one part of the city, and simply another face in the crowd in another. She may move between these environments, adjusting how she presents herself depending on where she is, who she is speaking to, and what is expected. Nothing is fixed, everything is responsive, and you begin to see that the world she navigates is layered. Not just Egyptian, not just foreign, but something in between. A blending of influences that creates both possibility and uncertainty. And through it all, there's a constant awareness of position. Who has power? Who belongs? Who is seen as temporary? Because in a place built on movement, not everyone is equally rooted. Some people arrive and become part of the city, their presence absorbed over time until it feels permanent. Others remain on the edges, always slightly outside, always aware that they are guests in a system that was not built with them in mind. And yet they remain, adapting, learning, finding ways to exist within a world that does not fully recognize them, but cannot entirely exclude them either. And in that space, between belonging and distance, her life unfolds, quietly, carefully, always adjusting to the shifting currents of a city that is never entirely still. Not every woman in ancient Egypt's commercial sex economy was there by choice. It is important to understand this, even in a quiet story like this one, because while some lives were shaped by circumstance, others were shaped by something far more final, the absence of choice. You begin to notice how layered this world really is. At first, it can seem like a spectrum, different paths, different outcomes, different degrees of control, but beneath that there is a deeper divide, one that separates those who can decide, even within limits, and those who cannot. Egypt was a society that practiced slavery, and within that system there were people who existed outside the protections you have just begun to understand. They could not own property. They could not bring complaints in the same way. They could not walk into a court and expect their voice to be heard as their own. Their lives were directed by others. Some of these women arrived in Egypt through conflict. Taken during military campaigns, moved far from their original homes, placed into a new environment where language, customs, and expectations were unfamiliar. Others may have been born into this condition, inheriting a status that was never chosen and could not easily be changed. For them, the idea of negotiation becomes something different. It is no longer about setting terms or choosing clients or deciding when to work. It becomes about endurance, about navigating each moment as it comes, with limited control over what happens next. And yet, even within this absence of choice, human behavior does not disappear. People still adapt. You begin to understand that survival in these circumstances often depends on small adjustments, learning how to read moods, recognizing which situations are safer, which are not. understanding how to move through a space in a way that reduces risk even slightly. These are not freedoms, but they are forms of awareness. They are also relationships, though they may not look like the ones you expect. Bonds formed between individuals who share similar conditions. Quiet moments of cooperation. Small acts of assistance that pass unnoticed by those in control. A shared understanding even without words. You begin to realize that history rarely records these details. Official documents do not dwell on the emotional or personal realities of those without status. They record ownership, transactions, outcomes, just not experiences. So much of this world exists in silence. But that silence is not emptiness. It is simply unrecorded. You imagine the contrast between two lives unfolding side by side in the same city. One woman able to make limited choices, to negotiate, to move between spaces with some degree of control. Another living within fixed boundaries, her path directed externally, her options defined by others. From a distance, they may appear similar. Up close, they are not. This difference shapes everything. And yet, both exist within the same broader system, the same streets, the same markets, the same shifting rhythms of daily life. Their experiences overlap, but they are not equal. You begin to understand how easy it is, looking back, to blur these distinctions, to speak about women in the trade as if it were a single category, a single experience, but it was not. It was many experiences layered together, some defined by choice within constraint, others defined by the absence of choice entirely. And acknowledging that difference matters, not to disrupt the calm of the story, but to ground it, to remind you that beneath the structure, beneath the systems, there were real lives shaped by very different circumstances. Some navigated, some endured, all existed within a world that did not always offer fairness, but still required them to continue. And so they did, quietly, persistently, finding ways, however small, to move through a reality that had already been decided for them, long before they had the chance to choose anything at all. Tucked away in museum collections and once kept carefully out of public view, are fragments of ancient Egyptian art that speak more directly about human intimacy than most official records ever dared to. These pieces are rare, not because they did not exist, but because they were not always preserved, displayed, or even discussed openly in later periods. And yet they remain, small windows into a different layer of this world. You begin to understand that ancient Egypt did not treat the human body with the same quiet discomfort that many later cultures would. The body was present in their art, their religion, and their daily life. It was something to be understood, cared for, and at times represented with surprising openness, but not always in the way you might expect. One of the most well-known examples is what is now called the Turin Erotic Papyrus. It is a scroll created during the New Kingdom that contains a series of illustrated scenes. At first glance, these scenes appear explicit, direct, unambiguous in their subject. But as you look more closely, something else begins to emerge. The figures are exaggerated, their proportions slightly distorted. The situations they're placed in feel unusual, even theatrical. There is a sense, not of documentation, but of performance, of something meant to be seen, reacted to, perhaps even laughed at. It does not feel like a record of ordinary life. It feels like commentary. You begin to realize that this scroll may not have been intended as a guide or a reflection of daily practice, but as something closer to satire, a playful, exaggerated take on human behavior, a reminder that even in a highly structured society, There was room for humour, for exaggeration, for a kind of storytelling that did not take itself entirely seriously, and that detail matters, because it shifts how you understand the material. Rather than treating these images as straightforward evidence of how people lived, you begin to see them as expressions of how people thought, how they imagined, how they entertained themselves in quieter moments. There is something almost familiar in that. The idea that humour and exaggeration can coexist with structure and order. That even in a society built on rules and balance, there is space for something lighter. You also begin to notice what is missing. There are no labels, no explanations, no accompanying text that tells you exactly how these images were meant to be interpreted. The meaning is left open, shaped by context, by perspective, by the passage of time. And so, much of what we understand about these papyri comes from careful observation and cautious interpretation. Historians look at the style, the setting, the way figures are arranged. They compare it to other forms of Egyptian art, to written texts, to the broader cultural framework. And even then, conclusions remain tentative. Nothing is entirely certain, but perhaps that uncertainty is part of what makes these fragments so compelling. They remind you that not everything in the ancient world was formalized or recorded with precision, that there were spaces, private, creative, expressive, where people explored ideas in ways that did not need to be officially documented. You imagine who might have seen this scroll when it was first created. A small group, perhaps. Not displayed publicly, but shared in a more intimate setting. Passed from hand to hand. Viewed in moments of leisure, when the demands of daily life had quieted for a while. There may have been laughter, or curiosity, or quiet reflection. We cannot know. And that, in a way, is fitting. Because this piece of art, like so many others from this time, exists somewhere between clarity and mystery. It offers a glimpse, but not a full explanation, a suggestion, but not a conclusion. You begin to understand that this is often how history works, not as a complete picture, but as a collection of fragments, each one offering a small piece of understanding, while leaving space for interpretation, and within those fragments you can sense something human, a willingness to observe, to imagine, to create. Even in a world defined by structure and order, there was still room for expression, for humour, and for the quiet acknowledgement that human life, in all its complexity, could be both serious and light at the same time. And that balance, like so much else in ancient Egypt, was simply another part of the world she moved through. Ancient Egypt was a society built on order, not just physical order, like the steady flooding of the Nile or the careful construction of temples, but social order, a quiet understanding of how people were expected to live, behave, and fit into the world around them. This idea was called mahat, balance, truth, harmony. And within that balance, every person was meant to occupy a place. You begin to notice how clearly these roles are defined. A wife, a mother, a daughter, a priestess, a worker. Each role comes with expectations, with patterns that others recognize and understand. These roles are not only personal, they are public, seen, observed, and quietly reinforced by the community. And when someone exists outside those expectations, it does not go unnoticed. You can almost feel it in the atmosphere of a neighborhood, the subtle shifts in conversation, the way voices lower when certain topics are mentioned, the quick glances that pass between people who believe they understand more than they say. There is no need for formal judgment. The community provides its own. For a woman whose life does not align with the accepted roles, this creates a different kind of environment. Not always openly hostile, but rarely neutral. A space shaped by awareness, by assumption, by quiet, persistent observation. You imagine her moving through familiar streets, fetching water, passing through the market, standing among others who share the same physical space but not the same social position. She is seen, recognized, but not necessarily included in the same way. There are conversations she is not part of, invitations that do not reach her, small moments where distance becomes visible, and yet this distance is not always absolute. Human behavior is rarely that simple. Some neighbors may keep their distance entirely, guided by social expectations or personal beliefs. Others may interact more openly, balancing practicality with judgment. After all, daily life still requires cooperation. Water must be drawn, goods must be exchanged, paths must be shared. So the relationship becomes layered, neither full acceptance nor complete exclusion. Something in between. You begin to understand that reputation in this world is not just about truth. It is about perception, about what people believe, what they assume, what they repeat to one another in quiet moments. And once a reputation forms, it becomes difficult to change. Not because it is always accurate, but because it is shared, reinforced through small interactions, through tone, through the way a person is spoken about when they are not present. You can almost hear those conversations, not loud, not confrontational, but steady, cautionary. A mother advising her daughter, a neighbour offering a quiet warning, a scribe, perhaps, writing words of advice that reflect these same attitudes in a more formal way. The message is consistent. Stay within the expected path. Avoid what lies outside it. And yet, what lies outside that path continues to exist. Because society, no matter how structured, always contains spaces that do not fit neatly within its rules. You begin to see how she navigates this, not by confronting the system directly, but by moving within it carefully, choosing when to speak, when to remain silent, understanding which interactions are necessary, which are avoidable. There is a kind of intelligence in this, a social awareness that develops over time, shaped by experience rather than instruction. And perhaps, over time, there are small pockets of familiarity, people who grow accustomed to her presence, who begin to see her not only as a role, but as a person. These moments may be rare, but they exist. Because even in a structured society, individual relationships can shift. Slowly, quietly, without announcement. You begin to understand that stigma in this world is not always loud. It doesn't always arrive as confrontation or conflict. More often it is subtle, woven into daily interactions, present in the spaces between words, and yet life continues within it. She walks the same streets, breathes the same air, lives within the same rhythms of day and night. Not fully embraced, not entirely excluded, but present, always present. And in that presence, she becomes part of the very society that quietly holds her at a distance. A reminder that even in a world built on order, there are lives that exist just beyond its edges, still visible, still real, still moving forward, one day at a time. Time moves differently when you begin to pay attention to it. At first, it feels distant, something that happens slowly, almost imperceptibly as days blend into one another. But over time, small changes begin to appear. Subtle at first, easy to overlook, until they are not. In ancient Egypt, as in many places, youth was closely tied to value. Not officially written into law, not declared outright, but present in art, in expectation, in the quiet preferences of society. Smooth skin, dark hair, a certain way of moving, these were not just aesthetic details, they were signals, markers of vitality, of possibility. And as those markers begin to shift, so does everything around them. You imagine her noticing it gradually, the way certain looks linger a little less, the way attention shifts not dramatically but enough to be felt. A moment of hesitation where there once was certainty, a pause where there once was ease. Nothing is sudden. It unfolds slowly over months, over years, woven into the rhythm of everyday life. But in a world without long-term security, without structured support, these changes carry weight. Because survival is not only about the present moment, it is about what comes next. You begin to understand that there is no single path forward, no clear transition that everyone follows. Instead, there are possibilities, some more stable than others. Some women shift roles gradually, from direct participation in the trade to something more indirect, managing spaces instead of occupying them, overseeing interactions rather than being at their centre. A tavern, perhaps, a small place where others gather, where the structure of the environment provides a different kind of stability. This transition, when it happens, is not always planned. It emerges from circumstance, from relationships built over time, from opportunities that appear quietly, as us without announcement. Others may rely on connections, a long-standing relationship with a patron, a familiarity that has developed over repeated interactions, something that shifts from transaction to arrangement, from momentary to sustained. These paths are uncertain, dependent on the reliability of another person, but they exist. And for some, there may be enough accumulation, goods, property, small savings, to step away entirely, to move into a different role within the community, not fully removed from the past, but no longer defined by it in the same way. But these outcomes are not guaranteed. For many, the path is less stable. Opportunities become less frequent. Competition increases. The environment once navigated with confidence becomes more difficult to move through. The same awareness that once guided decisions now highlights limitations. You begin to see how precarious this stage can be, because aging in itself is not the challenge. It is aging within a system that does not account for it. There are no pensions, no structured retirement, no formal recognition of a life spent working. The systems that exist are designed for the present, not the future. So adaptation becomes essential, not dramatic, not sudden, but continuous. Small adjustments, new roles, shifting expectations, and through it all there is memory. The knowledge of how things were, the awareness of change, not as a single event, but as a series of moments that gradually reshape the way the world responds. You imagine quieter days, less movement, more observation, watching others step into roles that once felt familiar, and recognizing patterns that repeat, even as individual lives differ. There may be a sense of distance, not from the world itself, but from the pace of it. The urgency that once defined each day begins to soften, not because the need for survival disappears, but because the way it is approached changes. And within that shift there is something else, a kind of perspective, an understanding of the system not just as a participant, but as someone who has moved through it, who has seen its patterns, its rhythms, its limitations. This understanding does not remove the challenges, but it changes how they are perceived. You begin to realize that aging in this world is not simply a decline. It is a transition, not always gentle, not always secure, but still a movement forward, and like so many other parts of her life, it is navigated quietly, so without announcement, without recognition from the structures that surround her, but with the same persistence that has carried her this far. One day at a time, adjusting, adapting, continuing. Children are everywhere in ancient Egypt. You notice them quickly once you begin to look, running along the edges of the marketplace, sitting beside their parents as daily work unfolds, laughing, arguing, learning the rhythms of a world they are only just beginning to understand. They are part of everything. And yet, not all childhoods begin in the same place. You begin to think about what happens when a child is born into a life that already exists on the margins, a life that does not fully align with the expectations of society, a life shaped not only by circumstance, but by how others choose to see it. Because in a structured world, where roles and relationships carry meaning, the question of belonging begins early. Ancient Egypt did not treat illegitimacy in exactly the same rigid way as some later societies would. The boundaries were more fluid, less strictly defined. But that does not mean there were no consequences. A child's position could still be shaped by their parents' status, by whether there was a recognized father, by what could be proven, documented, or acknowledged within the systems that governed inheritance and identity. You begin to understand that these distinctions are often quiet, not announced loudly, not marked in obvious ways, but present in how opportunities unfold, in what is available and what is not, in how easily a person can move through the structures of society, or how often they encounter resistance. For a woman living on the margins, the arrival of a child changes everything. There is no pause in the world around her, no system designed to accommodate this new reality. Life continues with the same demands, the same expectations, the same need to navigate each day carefully. And so, choices must be made. Some women raise their children within the same environment they themselves inhabit. The child grows up close to the rhythms of that life, learning early how to observe, how to adapt, how to understand situations that are not always explained directly. There is a kind of closeness in this, a shared experience shaped by necessity. But there are also challenges. Stability is uncertain. Resources are limited. The future is not clearly defined. Other paths exist, though none are simple. In some cases, a child may be placed within another household, not always formally adopted in the way modern systems might define it, but integrated into a different environment, perhaps as a servant, an apprentice, or under the care of someone with more stability. These arrangements are not always permanent. They are shaped by circumstance, by relationships, by what is possible at a given moment. You begin to see how fluid these structures can be. There are no single answers, no uniform outcomes. Each situation unfolds differently. There is also the quiet presence of knowledge, shared between women, passed through experience rather than written instruction. Methods believed to prevent pregnancy, or to end it early, appear in medical papyri, described not with alarm, but with a kind of practical tone. This knowledge exists alongside everything else, part of the broader understanding of the body, of survival, of navigating a world where control is often limited. You begin to realize that motherhood, in this context, is not defined by a single experience. It can be protective, difficult, uncertain, deeply connected or shaped by separation, sometimes all at once, and through it all there is care, not always visible in the ways history prefers to record, but present in small, consistent actions, in the effort to provide, to protect, to guide, even when the path ahead is unclear. You imagine quiet moments, a child resting beside her, the noise of the outside world softened, if only briefly, a pause in the constant movement of daily life. These moments are not recorded. They do not appear in official documents or structured accounts, but they exist, and they matter, because within them, you see something that remains constant across time and place. The desire to nurture, to create some form of stability, even within uncertainty, to offer something forward, even when the future is not guaranteed, and in that effort, quiet and persistent, a different kind of legacy takes shape, not written, not preserved in stone, but carried forward, one life into the next. The human body in ancient Egypt was both understood and misunderstood in equal measure. You begin to notice this in the way people speak about illness. Not with panic, not with complete certainty, but the kind of quiet familiarity, as if sickness is not unexpected, but part of the rhythm of life, something to be managed, endured, and, when possible, treated. There are healers here. Some are trained, experienced, and respected within their communities. Others rely more on tradition, on knowledge passed from one person to another over time, and often the line between practical medicine and belief is not clearly defined. It does not need to be, because both are seen as part of the same system. You learn that medical knowledge in this world is recorded in texts like the Ebers Papyrus, long scrolls filled with observations, remedies, and instructions. Some are surprisingly practical, herbal mixtures that reduce pain, treatments for wounds, methods for dealing with infection. Others are more uncertain, incantations spoken alongside treatments, appeals to deities associated with both illness and healing. Words believed to carry power, not separate from medicine, but woven into it. You begin to understand that for the people living here, this combination makes sense. The body is not seen as separate from the world around it. Health is influenced by environment, by balance, by forces that are both physical and unseen. And so, treatment reflects that understanding. For a woman navigating the world you've been exploring, health is not an abstract concern. It is immediate, practical, essential. Her body is not only part of her identity, it is a means of survival, and so maintaining it becomes a daily consideration, not just something addressed when illness appears. You imagine the small routines that might shape this. Applying oils to protect the skin from dryness and cracking, using simple remedies for minor injuries before they become more serious, recognizing early signs of discomfort and responding quickly, because waiting may not be an option. But there are limits. Infections can spread quickly in a warm climate. Water, though essential, is not always clean. Crowded environments increase the risk of illness passing from one person to another, and when sickness takes hold, options become more uncertain. A healer may be consulted, remedies prepared, instructions followed carefully, with hope placed in both the treatment and the belief that accompanies it. Sometimes these efforts are enough, other times they are not. You begin to understand that uncertainty is a constant presence. There is no guarantee of recovery, no clear boundary between what can be treated and what cannot. Each case unfolds on its own terms, shaped by factors that are not always visible or understood. For women in this environment, there are also specific challenges, the physical demands of their work, or the possibility of repeated pregnancy. Conditions that are not always openly discussed but are quietly recognized and managed through shared knowledge. Some treatments are recorded, herbal preparations, mixtures applied or consumed, methods believed to restore balance or prevent further harm. Others exist outside written texts, passed between individuals, shared in private. Practical knowledge that does not require documentation to be useful. You begin to see how important this informal exchange is, because not everything can be found in a scroll. Some of the most valuable information comes from experience, from observation, from listening to those who have already faced similar challenges. And through all of this, there is a kind of resilience, not loud, not dramatic, but steady. An understanding that the body will not always cooperate, that illness may come without warning, that recovery when it happens is not something to take for granted, and yet life continues, work continues. The rhythms of daily existence do not pause, even when the body asks for rest. So adjustments are made, pace is altered, tasks are approached differently, and when possible, moments of stillness are taken, brief pauses where the body is allowed to recover, even slightly, before the next demand arises. You begin to understand that health in this world is not a fixed state. It is something that shifts, something that must be managed, maintained, and adapted to. And within that constant adjustment, she finds a way to continue. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but persistently, listening to her body, responding when she can, and moving forward within the limits and possibilities that exist around her, quietly, one day at a time. There are moments in history when everything seems to expand at once. Wealth, movement, ambition. Ancient Egypt's new kingdom is one of those moments. You can feel it in the scale of things. Temples rise larger than before, their walls covered in carvings that stretch across entire horizons of stone. Gold flows steadily from Nubian mines, carried along the Nile in quiet, heavy shipments. Armies move outward, returning with goods, resources, and people from distant lands. The world feels fuller, more connected, more active than it has been in generations. And as this expansion unfolds, daily life shifts in ways that are both subtle and significant. Cities grow, not all at once, not in a sudden transformation, but steadily. Then more people arrive, more goods circulate, markets become louder, more crowded, more layered with different voices and languages. Trade routes thicken with movement, linking regions that once felt distant into a network that is constantly in motion. You begin to notice how this affects everything. Where there is more trade, there is more money, or its equivalent in goods. Where there is more wealth, there is more demand. And where there is demand, new opportunities quietly emerge. For some, this period brings stability. For others, it brings something else. Possibility. You imagine the ports along the Nile busy with activity, boats arriving one after another, carrying grain, textiles, spices, metals, sailors stepping onto solid ground after long journeys, their pockets filled, their routines temporarily suspended. They are not here to stay, but while they are here, they participate in the life of the city, and the city responds. Taverns fill more quickly. Trade spaces remain active long after the sun has begun to lower. Conversations stretch into the evening, shaped by the presence of people who bring stories, goods, and expectations from far beyond the immediate surroundings. In this environment, the world of commercial intimacy becomes more visible, not because it is newly created, but because it is amplified. More people means more interaction. More movement means more anonymity. And within that anonymity, certain boundaries begin to soften. You begin to understand that this period does not necessarily make life easier, but it makes it busier, faster, more layered. Opportunities may increase, but so do risks. competition grows. The number of people navigating similar paths expands, each one adjusting to the same shifting conditions. Nothing remains static. Even the administrative systems reflect this expansion. More records are kept. More transactions are documented. The machinery of the state becomes more active, producing papyri that, centuries later, will offer glimpses into daily life. Fragments, details, small pieces of information that, when placed together, begin to form a broader picture. You realize that this is why we know more about this period, not because life was simpler, but because it was recorded more frequently. The system was running at full capacity, and in doing so, it left traces behind. For the women you have been following, this means something important. Their world becomes part of a larger system, not formally recognized, not officially structured, but present within the flow of goods, people, and interactions that define the new kingdom. They move within this expansion, adapting to it, finding space within it. Because even in times of prosperity, not all benefits are distributed evenly. Some people accumulate wealth, others circulate through it, participating but not necessarily retaining. You begin to see how this creates a rhythm, periods of activity followed by quieter moments, times when opportunities appear more frequently, followed by stretches where they are harder to find. A constant adjustment to the pace of a world that is growing, but not always in predictable ways. And yet, there is something steady beneath it all. The Nile continues to flow. The cycles of flooding and harvest remain unchanged. Even as the empire expands, these rhythms persist, anchoring everything else. You begin to understand that this contrast defines the experience of this period. Expansion above, consistency below. And between the two, countless lives moving through the space created by both. Her life is one of them, shaped not only by her immediate surroundings, but by the larger forces that ripple outward from distant campaigns, trade routes, and decisions made far beyond her reach. She may never see the mines of Nubia, she may never walk through the grandest temples, but their presence touches her life all the same, in the flow of goods, in the movement of people, in the quiet, constant expansion of a world that feels, for a moment, like it has no clear edges, and within that vastness she continues, not at the centre of it, but never entirely outside it either. Change does not always arrive all at once. Sometimes it comes quietly at first. A new language heard in the distance, different clothing in the marketplace, small shifts that, at first, feel temporary, and then, over time, those changes settle in. They stay. When Alexander the Great arrived in Egypt, he did not remain long, but what followed him did. A new structure, a new way of organizing the world, and most visibly a new city rising along the Mediterranean coast. Alexandria. You imagine it at its beginning. Not yet the vast crowded centre it would become, but already different. Planned rather than grown. Designed with intention, its streets laid out in straight lines, its buildings reflecting a style not native to the Nile. It feels ordered in a new way. Greek language begins to mingle with Egyptian speech. Greek customs appear alongside older traditions, and slowly a blending begins, not equal, not seamless, but persistent. You begin to understand that this is not simply an addition to what already exists, it is a transformation. The Ptolemaic rulers, successors to Alexander, bring with them their own ideas about society, about structure, about how people should be categorized and governed. And within this system, certain aspects of life become more formalized, more defined. The world of commercial intimacy is one of them, where before arrangements may have been fluid, shaped by circumstance and personal negotiation, now there are signs of regulation. Not always strict, not always consistent, but present. You learn of something called the pornikon telos, a tax associated with those working in this sphere. The existence of such a tax tells you something important, that this activity was visible enough to be recognized, common enough to be organized, and valuable enough to be taxed. This changes the nature of the work, not entirely, but noticeably. When something becomes part of an official system, even indirectly, it gains a different kind of presence. It is no longer only informal, no longer entirely outside structure. It exists within a framework, even if that framework is imperfect. You begin to see how this affects daily life. Categories become more rigid. Distinctions that were once fluid begin to harden. People are defined more clearly by their roles, their status, their position within the system. For some, this clarity provides stability. For others, it creates limitation. You imagine her moving through Alexandria. The city is larger than anything she's known before, its streets wider, its population more diverse. People from across the Mediterranean gather here. Greeks, Egyptians, traders from distant lands, scholars, soldiers. The air feels different, more crowded, more layered. Opportunities exist, but they are shaped by new expectations. Greek cultural views on gender and social roles are not identical to Egyptian ones. In some ways, they are more restrictive, more clearly divided. And so, navigation becomes more complex. She must understand not only one system, but two. When to follow older customs, when to adapt to newer ones. How to present herself depending on who she is interacting with, what language is being spoken, what assumptions are being made. Nothing is entirely stable. Everything requires adjustment. You begin to realize that Alexandria is not simply a place. It is a meeting point, a space where different worlds overlap, sometimes comfortably, sometimes not, where identities shift depending on context, where belonging is not always fixed but negotiated, and within that negotiation there is both possibility and tension. Some women may find new opportunities here. A larger city means more movement, more anonymity, more variation in clientele. Others may find the new structures limiting, the expectations less flexible than before. There is no single outcome, only variation. You imagine the harbour, ships arriving one after another, carrying goods, ideas, and people. The constant motion of arrival and departure. The sense that this city is connected to something much larger than itself, and within that motion she continues. Adapting, as she always has, learning the rhythms of a place that is still defining itself, because Alexandria is not yet finished. It is growing, changing, becoming something new with each passing year, and she is part of that change, not at the centre of it, but present within it, moving through its streets, its systems, its shifting expectations, finding her place within a world that is still deciding what it wants to be, quietly, carefully, always adjusting to what comes next. And by the time Cleopatra rules Egypt, the world you've been moving through has already changed many times. Layers have built upon layers. Egyptian traditions still exist, steady and familiar in many places, but they now sit alongside Greek customs that have been present for generations. The city of Alexandria, once new and unfamiliar, has become a centre of activity, intellectual, political and cultural. It is no longer forming, it is established, and within it, life moves at a different pace. you begin to sense that this is a world that is more visible, more recorded, more observed than the earlier periods you've explored. There are more written accounts, more descriptions from outside observers, more attempts to define and categorize what is happening. But with that visibility comes something else, interpretation, and not all of it is accurate. Cleopatra herself becomes an example of this. In her own time, she is known for intelligence, for political skill, for her ability to navigate a complex and shifting landscape of alliances and power. She speaks multiple languages. She understands both Egyptian and Greek traditions. She rules not just with presence, but with strategy. And yet, over time, her story becomes simplified, reduced, focused on aspects that are easier to retell, but not necessarily the most important. You begin to understand that this pattern extends beyond Cleopatra. It shapes how many lives from this period are remembered. For women existing within the world of commercial intimacy, this means their experiences are often filtered through the perspectives of others. Writers, observers, commentators, each bringing their own assumptions, their own interpretations, their own biases. The result is a picture that is clearer in some ways, but also more complicated. You learn about the hetairai, women within the Greek cultural framework who occupy a distinct social role. They are not wives, not bound by the same expectations of domestic life. Instead, they exist in a space that allows for a degree of independence, particularly among the more established and educated. Some are known for their conversation, their wit, their ability to engage with influential men in intellectual as well as social settings. They move within circles that offer visibility and in some cases influence. But this is only one part of the picture. Because not all women in this world share that position. Beneath this more visible layer exists a broader spectrum. Women whose lives are less documented, less described, but no less real. Those working in taverns, in streets, in quieter corners of the city where daily survival takes precedence over social recognition. You begin to see how wide this range truly is. From those who navigate elite social circles to those who remain on the margins, from relative stability to constant uncertainty, and everything in between. Cleopatra's Alexandria contains all of this, a city of contrasts, where wealth and poverty exist side by side, where intellectual debate unfolds in one space, while daily survival is negotiated in another, where visibility does not necessarily equal understanding. You imagine walking through the city, past large public buildings, their scale impressive, their presence undeniable, through marketplaces filled with goods from across the known world, along streets where languages overlap, creating a constant shifting sound. And within that movement, individuals navigating their own paths, some moving with confidence, familiar with the structures around them, others adjusting constantly, responding to changes that are not always predictable. You begin to understand that this period offers more information, but not necessarily more clarity. There are more records, yes, but also more perspectives layered on top of one another, some accurate, some distorted, all requiring careful interpretation. And through it all, her life continues to unfold within this environment, not defined solely by the categories others create, not fully captured by the records that remain, but shaped by the same patterns you have seen before: adaptation, observation, adjustment. The city may be larger now, more complex, more connected to the wider world, but the core of her experience remains familiar, navigating systems that are not entirely designed for her, finding space within structures that shift over time, continuing forward within a world that records some things clearly, and leaves others in quiet shadow, and in those shadows much of her story remains, not lost, just waiting to be understood differently. Religion in ancient Egypt is everywhere, not in a distant or abstract way, but woven directly into daily life. You see it in the small objects people carry, in the symbols carved into doorways, in the quiet rituals performed without ceremony or audience. It is not something separate from life. It is part of it. You begin to notice how belief operates on different levels. There are grand temples, of course, vast, impressive, filled with priests, offerings, and carefully structured rituals. These are the official spaces, the visible ones. But beyond them, there is another layer, quieter, closer, more personal. Inside homes, tucked into corners or placed carefully on small shelves, are simple shrines. Not elaborate, not grand, but meaningful. Small figurines, amulets, carved symbols, objects chosen not for display, but for connection. This is where belief becomes intimate. You imagine her in this space, not surrounded by crowds or formal rituals, but alone, or perhaps in the presence of a few familiar faces. The noise of the outside world softened for a moment. The constant movement of daily life paused, if only briefly. Here she turns to the same figures others do. Taweret, the protective goddess often depicted with the body of a hippopotamus, associated with childbirth and safety. Bess, a small, fierce-looking figure believed to guard households, especially women and children. These are not distant, unreachable deities. They are close, present, invoked in moments of need. Landas, you begin to understand that these household gods serve a different purpose than the great temple deities. They are not concerned with maintaining cosmic order on a grand scale. They are focused on immediate concerns, health, safety, protection, the kinds of things that shape daily survival. And for someone navigating the kind of life you've been exploring, these concerns are constant. You imagine the quiet act of placing an offering, a small portion of food, a gesture of acknowledgement. Not extravagant, not ceremonial, but consistent. A way of maintaining a relationship with something believed to have influence over what cannot be controlled. There are no guarantees here, no certainty that a prayer will be answered. But the act itself carries meaning. It creates a sense of connection, of participation in something larger, even when the world feels uncertain. You begin to realize that belief in this context is not always about doctrine. It is about reassurance, about finding stability in something that does not shift as quickly as the external world, because the external world does shift, constantly. Opportunities change, risks appear and disappear, relationships form and dissolve. There is very little that remains entirely predictable, and within that unpredictability, the idea of protection becomes important. Not absolute protection, not immunity from difficulty, but the possibility of guidance, of influence, of something watching, even if unseen. You imagine her speaking quietly, not in formal language, not in rehearsed phrases, but in her own words, expressing concern, asking for safety, perhaps offering thanks when something goes right. Yeah, these moments are not recorded. They do not appear in official texts or historical accounts, but they exist, because the need behind them is universal. You begin to understand that religion, at this level, is less about structure and more about presence, a constant awareness that there are forces beyond immediate control, and a desire to engage with them in whatever way feels possible, even if only through small gestures, even if only in private. And over time, these gestures become part of routine, as natural as preparing food, as familiar as the rhythm of day and night. They do not remove uncertainty, but they soften it. They provide a sense of continuity in a life where many things remain fluid. You begin to see that this private devotion is not separate from her life. It is part of how she moves through it, how she prepares, how she reflects, how she finds moments of stillness within a world that rarely pauses. And in those moments, quiet and unobserved, she creates a space that belongs entirely to her. A space where she's not defined by roles, by expectations, or by how others see her, but simply present, speaking in her own way to something she believes is listening, and that in itself becomes a form of stability, small, unseen, but deeply real. As you step back from everything you have seen, a quiet realization begins to settle in, not about what is present, but about what is missing. Because for all the detail you have explored, the cities, the systems, the structures, the rhythms of daily life, there is still a silence that runs through it all, a space where certain voices do not fully appear, and once you notice it, it is difficult to ignore. History, as it has been recorded for most of human existence, is selective, not intentionally, not always consciously, but inevitably. It preserves what is written, what is carved, what is deemed important by those who had the ability to record it. And those people, scribes, officials, priests, rulers, had their own priorities, their own perspectives, their own definitions of what mattered. You begin to understand that this shapes everything. The grand monuments remain. The stories of rulers are preserved in careful detail. Administrative records document transactions, taxes, and legal disputes with precision. But lives like hers, they do not fit neatly into those categories. They are not the focus of official attention, not the subject of monumental inscriptions. Not the kind of story that was traditionally considered worth preserving in full. So they appear only in fragments, a name in a document, a passing reference in a legal case, a suggestion in a piece of advice written by someone else. Small traces, nothing complete. You begin to see how this creates the illusion of absence, as if these lives were rare or insignificant, or somehow outside the main flow of history. But that is not the case. They were present, consistently, quietly woven into the fabric of daily life. It is not that they did not exist, it is that they were not recorded in the same way. And over time, that difference becomes distance. Centuries pass, documents are lost, damaged, forgotten. What remains is shaped not only by what survived physically, but by what was chosen to be written down in the first place. And so, when certain stories become clear, others fade. You begin to understand that recovering these lives requires a different kind of attention, not just reading what is there, but noticing what is not, looking at the gaps, asking why certain details are missing and what those absences might mean. Because silence in history is not empty. It carries information of its own. It tells you where attention was directed and where it was not. It reveals the boundaries of what was considered visible, and through that understanding something begins to shift. The fragments take on new meaning. A brief mention in a court record is no longer just a line of text. It becomes evidence of presence. A small confirmation that someone lived, acted, spoke, existed within that system. A piece of a larger story that was never fully written. And you begin to imagine how many of these stories there were. Lives lived entirely outside the structures that preserved history. Experiences shared, decisions made, paths taken, none of them recorded in detail, but all of them real. And in that realization, the silence becomes less absolute. Because even without full records, patterns emerge across different sources, across different periods, enough to suggest continuity, enough to understand that these lives were not isolated. They were part of something broader, something persistent. You begin to see that history is not only what is written, it is also what can be inferred, what can be carefully reconstructed from fragments, from context, from the quiet spaces between more prominent narratives. And within that reconstruction there is a kind of recognition, not complete, not perfect, but meaningful, because it acknowledges what was overlooked. It brings attention to what was once left in the background, and it reminds you that history is not only made of grand events and powerful figures, it is also made of ordinary lives, lives that adapted, endured, and continued within systems that did not always prioritize them. You return for a moment to the image of her, moving through her world, navigating its structures, making decisions within its limits, living a life that was real, complex, and entirely her own, even if it was not fully recorded. And perhaps that is the final understanding. That history does not need to have preserved every detail for a life to have mattered. Presence does not depend on documentation. It exists regardless. And in recognizing that, even quietly, you begin to restore something. Yeah, not the full story, but the acknowledgement that it was there, that she was there, living, adapting, continuing, within a world that remembered only fragments, but was shaped in part by her all the same. And in that quiet recognition, the silence becomes just a little less complete. If you step back from everything, the systems, the labels, the fragments of recorded history, you begin to notice something quieter, a rhythm, not written down, not formally described, but steady, repeating, shaping everything beneath the surface. It is the rhythm of survival. You imagine waking before the city fully stirs. There is a softness to the early morning. The air is cooler, carrying less dust, less noise. For a brief moment the world feels suspended, as if it has not yet decided what it will become that day. And in that moment there is space. Not for long, but enough to notice. She wakes not to a fixed schedule, but to awareness, a quiet assessment of what the day might require. There is no certainty, no guarantee of how the hours ahead will unfold, only possibilities. And so the day begins not with action, but with observation. You begin to understand that there's where everything starts, not in movement, but in attention. The city slowly rises around her. Voices begin to layer over one another. Footsteps increase. The distant sounds of trade, of labour, of conversation drift into clarity. The day builds, gradually, and she moves with it. Not ahead of it, not behind it, but within it. There is no single path through the day, no predictable sequence that can be relied upon. Some days bring interaction early, quickly pulling her into the flow of activity. Others unfold more slowly, requiring patience, waiting, careful positioning within the spaces where opportunity might appear. You begin to see how much of this life is shaped by timing, being in the right place, at the right moment, with the right awareness of what is happening around her. And yet, this is not luck, it is learned. Over time, patterns emerge, not fixed patterns, but tendencies. Certain times of day bring certain kinds of people. Certain areas of the city shift in energy depending on the hour, the season, the movement of trade. She learns these patterns, not through instruction, but through repetition, through experience, through noticing what works and what does not. You begin to understand that survival here is not dramatic, it is subtle. A series of small decisions made continuously, when to step forward, when to remain still, when to engage, when to withdraw. These choices are rarely visible to others. They happen quietly, almost instinctively, but they shape everything. The day moves on. Heat rises. The intensity of the sun presses down, changing the pace of the city. Movement slows slightly. Conversations shorten. Energy shifts. Even the air feels heavier. And within this shift, she adjusts. Always adjusting. There is no fixed pace. Only responsiveness. You begin to notice how this constant adjustment creates its own form of stability. Not because anything is guaranteed, but because she knows how to respond when it is not. That knowledge becomes a kind of foundation. Not solid, not unchanging, but reliable enough. The afternoon stretches. The rhythm softens, then rises again as the day begins to transition. And yes, people return to the streets with renewed energy. Trade resumes. Movement increases once more. And again, she moves within it. Never fully at rest, but never entirely without control either. You begin to realize that this rhythm is not exhausting in the way you might expect. Because it is not chaotic, it is fluid. There is a difference. Chaos overwhelms, fluidity adapts, and she has learned to adapt. Over time, this rhythm becomes familiar, not comfortable, not easy, but known. And in that familiarity there is something steady, something she can rely on, even when nothing else feels certain. The day will change, the city will shift, but the rhythm remains, and as long as she can move with it, she continues, quietly, consistently, one moment at a time, for all the movement, all the noise, all the constant awareness. Oh, there are still moments where everything slows, not completely, but enough. You begin to notice them only after spending time within this world. At first, the city feels continuous, sound layered over sound, motion following motion, one moment leading directly into the next. But then gradually you begin to see the spaces between. Small pauses, moments that do not demand anything, moments that simply exist. You imagine the late afternoon, when the sun begins to lower but has not yet released its hold on the sky. The light softens slightly. Shadows stretch across the ground, creating pockets of shade that feel cooler, calmer. People move differently now. Less urgency, less intensity. Conversations drift instead of press forward. And within this shift she finds space, not by accident, but by instinct. A place just outside the busiest path, a familiar edge of the marketplace, a quiet wall that catches shade at just the right time of day, a step, a corner, a doorway where the world feels slightly removed. These places are not marked, they are discovered, learned over time. You begin to understand that stillness in this world is not given, it is found, and once found, it is protected. Even if only for a few moments, you imagine her sitting there, not doing anything in particular, not preparing, not observing with intention, not calculating the next move, just sitting. The sounds of the city still present, but distant now, softened. No longer something that requires immediate response. There is a difference between hearing and listening. In these moments she hears, without needing to act, and that changes everything. You begin to feel the shift yourself, the way tension loosens slightly, the way the mind, so used to tracking details, begins to release its grip. Thoughts move more slowly, less urgently. There is no pressure here, no expectation, just a pause, and within that pause something settles, You realize how necessary this is, because without it the rhythm of survival becomes continuous, unbroken, a constant forward movement with no space to breathe, no moment to step back. Stillness is not escape, it is restoration. A brief return to balance before the rhythm begins again. You imagine her closing her eyes for a moment, not asleep, but resting, letting the warmth of the air settle against her skin, letting the sounds of the world drift without meaning, letting herself exist without needing to respond to anything at all. Hey, these moments are not long, they cannot be. The world will return, the demands of the day will rise again, the rhythm will resume, pulling her back into motion. But even a short pause is enough to reset, enough to continue. You begin to notice that these moments appear in different forms, not only in quiet corners, but in small, unexpected pauses throughout the day. A break in conversation, a lull in activity, a stretch of time where nothing urgent happens. They are easy to overlook, but once seen, they become part of the rhythm too, not separate from it, but woven into it. You begin to understand that peace, in this life, is not something large or permanent. It is not found in complete escape from the world. It exists in fragments, in moments, in brief spaces where the weight of everything else lifts just slightly. And that is enough, because those fragments accumulate, they carry forward, they make the rest possible. You imagine her rising again after one of these pauses, not dramatically, not with sudden energy, but gently, returning to the movement of the world with a quieter mind, a steadier presence, ready to continue. And as she steps back into the rhythm of the day, you realize something simple. Stillness is not the absence of life. It is part of it, a necessary counterbalance to everything else. A quiet space that allows the rest to exist without becoming too much. And in that balance, she finds her way forward. As the day begins to loosen its hold, the city changes again. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, almost imperceptibly. You begin to notice the shift in the light first. The brightness softens. The sharp edges of the afternoon fade into something warmer, more diffuse. Shadows stretch longer across the ground, blending into one another until the distinction between light and dark becomes less defined. Everything feels slower. The urgency that carried the day forward begins to dissolve. You imagine people moving with less intention now. The pace of footsteps softens. Conversations lose their sharpness, becoming quieter, more reflective. The constant exchange of goods and words begins to taper, replaced by something less structured, less demanding. And within this shift she begins to withdraw, not completely, but gently. You begin to understand that the end of the day is not marked by a single moment. There is no clear boundary where everything stops. Instead, it fades, like the light itself, transitioning slowly from activity into rest. She moves toward a familiar space, not necessarily permanent, not entirely secure, but known. A place where she can return without needing to think about where to go next. A place that does not require explanation or negotiation. And that familiarity matters, because after a day shaped by constant awareness, by small decisions and careful observation, the mind begins to seek something simpler, stillness. You imagine her sitting or lying down, the body gradually releasing the tension it has been carrying. Muscles that have remained alert begin to soften. Breathing slows, not intentionally, but naturally. The sounds as the city continue, but they change in quality. No longer sharp or demanding, they become distant, like a background presence rather than something that requires attention. Voices blur together, footsteps fade, even the air feels different, cooler, quieter, carrying less weight. You begin to feel it too, the gradual descent from activity into rest, the way thoughts begin to lose their edges, less structured, less urgent. There is no need to plan the next moment, no need to anticipate what might happen next. The day is ending, and with it, the need for constant response begins to dissolve. You realize that this transition is not only physical, it is mental, emotional, a slow release from the rhythm of survival into something softer, something less defined. You imagine her closing her eyes, not immediately falling asleep, but resting in that space between awareness and absence, letting the day settle into memory, as gesta, without needing to analyze it or hold on to it. There is no review of what has happened, no need to measure success or failure. The day simply ends, and that is enough. You begin to understand that this is where balance returns. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to begin again, because tomorrow will come, the rhythm will resume, the same patterns will rise again, shaped by new variables, new moments, new decisions. But for now, there is nothing to do, nothing to decide, nothing to respond to. Only the quiet presence of the moment as it fades into something deeper. You feel the world softening around you, the edges of thought dissolving. The steady movement of the day replaced by something slower, gentler, quieter. And in that quiet there is rest, not as an escape, but as a continuation, a necessary part of the rhythm that allows everything else to exist. And as the last fragments of the day drift away, you follow them, slowly, gently, letting everything settle into stillness. And now, as everything begins to settle, you find yourself returning to the beginning, not to the myths, not to the simplified versions of history that are easy to remember, but to something quieter, something more real. You think of her again, not as a figure shaped by categories or labels, but as a person, someone who moved through her world one day at a time, someone who made decisions, small and constant, within the limits and possibilities that surrounded her. There is no single defining moment, no dramatic turning point that captures everything. Instead, there is continuity, a life built from repetition, from rhythm, from persistence. You begin to understand that this is what history often misses, not the events themselves, but the texture of living through them, the ordinary moments that are never recorded, the small decisions that shape entire lives without ever being written down. You imagine her walking through the same streets again, not as part of a story, but as part of her reality. The sounds of the city around her, the shifting patterns of movement, the familiar places that hold meaning not because they are important, but because they are known. And in that familiarity, there is something steady, not permanent, but enough. You begin to notice how much of her life exists outside of what history preserves. The pauses, the moments of stillness, the quiet exchanges that leave no record. These are not the kinds of things that are carved into stone or written into official texts, and yet they are the majority of experience. They are where life actually happens. You let that idea settle. There is no need to analyze it, no need to draw conclusions or extract meaning beyond what is already there. Just an awareness, a recognition that behind every system, every structure, every fragment of recorded history, there are lives that moved through it quietly, not seeking to be remembered, not shaped for storytelling, simply lived. You begin to feel the distance between what is recorded and what is real, and how much of that distance is filled with lives like hers, unwritten, unpreserved, but no less present. You imagine the passage of time, years turning into decades, generations passing, the city changing slowly at first, and then more noticeably, buildings altered, languages shifting, customs evolving, and within all of that change, countless lives unfolding in ways that leave only the faintest traces behind. You begin to understand that history is not incomplete by accident. It is incomplete by nature, because it can only hold what was chosen to be recorded, and what managed to survive. Everything else exists in silence. But that silence is not empty. It is full of lives that were lived fully, even if they were not preserved fully. You return one last time to her, not to define her, not to summarize her, but simply to acknowledge her, a person within a system, a life within a larger world, moving, adapting, continuing, day after day, moment after moment, without needing to be remembered in order to matter. And now, as the story reaches its quiet end, no, there is nothing left to add, no final lesson, no conclusion that needs to be drawn. Only the understanding that you have spent time within a world that once existed, and within it, a life that unfolded quietly, persistently, and completely. You let that understanding rest. No urgency, no expectation, just the slow, steady feeling of something coming to a close, and as the last thoughts begin to soften, you allow them to drift, like the end of a long day, like the fading of distant sounds, until there is nothing left to follow, only stillness and rest. And now, there is nothing more you need to follow. The city has grown quiet, the sounds have softened, and the story has come to rest. You have walked through ancient streets, stood in crowded marketplaces, listened to voices that history only partially remembered. You have followed a life not often told, one that moved quietly beneath the surface of everything else, and now you can let it go. There's nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to understand. The details can fade, the names can drift. The world you've been in can gently dissolve, like footprints in soft sand slowly carried away by time. You don't need to remember everything, just the feeling, the calm, the steady rhythm that carried you here. Let your thoughts slow, let them soften. If anything remains, let it be distant, like a quiet echo that no longer asks for your attention. Your body can rest now. Your mind can rest. There is nowhere else to go, nothing else to do. Just breathe slowly and allow yourself to settle deeper into stillness. And if sleep comes, let it come gently. You've done enough for today. You see, you've followed the story all the way to its quiet end, and now you can drift, slowly, softly, into rest.